Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this this webinar with Gold Standard and guests. I'm Jamie Ballantyne. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications for Gold Standard, and we're very delighted to have you all joining us for this webinar. I'm going to run through the agenda in a second and introduce you very briefly to our excellent panelists. But first, I'd like to do kind of a little bit of housekeeping. So there will be a kind of brief opportunity for questions at the end. We've had a lot of interest in this webinar, so please put any questions you have in the Q&A function, and I'll put them to the panelists at the end of the session. We'll have a relatively limited time for questions, but we'll get through as many as we can. And it should also note that this is meant to be the kind of start of a conversation rather than the final word. So please feel free to kind of get in contact with us at Gold Standard with your views, either on social media through our Twitter and LinkedIn handles, or kind of directly. There's various links on the press release which I sent out to people who had registered for this webinar earlier in the day. The webinar will be recorded, so we'll also send out a link for those who are interested in watching back within the next couple of days. And so feel free to obviously watch it back and also share with anyone else you think that you would find useful. So I'll just quickly run through the agenda for the session. Firstly, quick introduction from me. We're in it now. Then I'm going to pass over to my colleague Owen, who's going to talk about the framework launched today and the hopeful value of it. We're then going to have kind of half an hour for a panel discussion with our esteemed panelists, and as I said at the end, kind of 10 to 15 minutes for questions from the audience on anything that we've covered so far. So I won't go into all of the kind of long list of all of our panelists' achievements, but briefly, who we have on the line to talk to you today is Owen Hewlett from Gold Standard. Owen's our Chief Technical Officer. We've also got Lene Pettersson from WWF Switzerland, Steve Rosenberg from General Mills, and Robert Hoagland from Milky Wire. So we've got people from right across the NGO, corporate and finance sector to hopefully inform you about what's going on and bring their unique perspectives to what we're talking about. As mentioned, we're going to start with a brief presentation from Owen. So I will pass over to him.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie, and hi, everybody. I'm lovely to see a lot of familiar faces and new faces. I'm Owen. I'm the Chief Technical Officer at the Gold Standard Foundation and one of the lead authors of the two publications today. And those two publications are a strategy framework for companies seeking to develop a climate mitigation strategy, and the second relates to some considerations, some things to think about when making climate mitigation related claims. And I want to explain a little bit about the kind of genesis and thinking and some of the content and observations in those frameworks. So I think, maybe broadly, just to start with the purpose, I think if we are to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, net zero and beyond, and the restoration of nature, etc., the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, then we need business to become a fair and positive contributor to those goals. And I don't mean contribute to, I mean they as an entity, them as an actor, overall becomes a positive contributor, not does some positive contributions here and there. But business generally isn't that right now. There are some great businesses that have made great strides, but in general, the private sector isn't a positive contributor to either of those sets of goals. And if they would want to be, then it would be quite hard for them to do. And that's because we're not super clear collectively on what that means. There is an avalanche of initiatives that chip away at parts of what it means, and we're not super great as a community at expressing the value of becoming so. And so what that means is, I mean, to use maybe a parable and a metaphor, is we have a kind of three blind men and an elephant problem, i.e., there's a big scary thing to do, and you can see little bits of it in fragments, but the whole is obscure to you. And we have a Maslow's hammer problem, which means because we can't see the whole, the tools that we do have, we go looking for nails with. And that's certainly true of things like the voluntary carbon market, for example. There are a number of initiatives about the voluntary carbon market set against how few there are, helping to define and unlock the tools that companies need elsewhere is somewhat telling, I think. And so that's really the genesis of this idea. We wanted to set about trying to define what a positive contribution means and providing the tools, the enabling conditions, and the expression of value for companies to actually do that, with the end game, the theory of change, if you like, of becoming a positive contributor. So if we go on a slide there, Jamie, what we published today, as I said, is in one part a framework or a playbook, if you like, that sets out the gold standards vision of what a positive corporate or positive organizational contributor to those goals looks like. We've set it out in principles and criteria because we're a standard setter, and that's how we like to lay things out. But I think it does help for legibility. But then we also wanted to say, what exists right now. So the third column there, you can see this is an excerpt from the framework, is about what are the tools that you could look at right now if you wanted to apply some of this stuff. And then the fourth column, the other interesting aspect is what do we think still needs to be developed? So let's be honest about, we want companies to be held to account, and we want them to feel positive about what they're doing, but let's also be honest about what actually exists to help them do it and start to map that out as well. And so the framework contains 5 principal sections. The first is on governance, so thinking about how organizations should embed this thinking at the highest level of their organization, and put in a good practice there. The second really speaks to dealing with emissions in the value chain, especially. The third is how to take responsibility for ongoing and a recommendation on historical emissions. The fourth talks about related issues, so stuff that's related to climate mitigation or stuff that would undermine your credibility if you didn't do. So thinking about things like single-use packaging, for example. And the fifth talks about making responsible claims. And there we supplement the framework document with a responsible claims guideline. It talks to some of the ideas and some of the pitfalls to look out for in that regard. If we go on a slide there, Jamie. And so I really wanted to kind of draw out, before we get into the panel, 3 main areas, some key observations that we made in writing this mitigation framework. And those relate to the sort of three of the biggest principles, really. So the first, on value chain abatement, our kind of takeaway is the need, and not always well understood need, for radical transition plans. So aligning with net zero doesn't mean carrying on your business in a slightly more efficient way. In many businesses, it'll mean a total rethink of how they deliver the products and services that they offer. There also needs to be a shift to celebrating mistakes. So one of the fears companies have is being called out for past errors. We need to get rid of that. Now, doesn't mean to say we move away from criticism, but it needs to be that companies are transparent about what they didn't get right, about the corrections they need to make, and not live in this fear of criticism of doing that, because it's that fear that drives us to sort of greenwash. And then lastly, and I know Steve will say a lot about this, the need to switch to models of collective action, especially when it comes to place-based action, like you see in the food, land, and agriculture sector, for example. Then in the responsibility for ongoing emissions bucket, we see a new opportunity for the voluntary carbon market, and that is in the progressive shift from offsetting towards positively and fairly contributing to global net zero efforts. And we'll hear, no doubt, from Lene and WWF, who did some real pioneering work around how companies should set internal carbon prices and use that to finance ambitious action. And also from Robert at Milky Wire, who is one of those pioneering mechanisms. And then the last observation there is the need to optimize the mix of things that you're financing or buying from things like carbon markets. So moving away from the paradigm of what's cheapest or what's available to thinking about what would be the optimal thing to finance with this pool of money. And then lastly, on claims, one of the big takeaways for us was headline claims look problematic. We already knew that. I think that's all over the discourse, but they look increasingly problematic when you see the various moving parts of a strategy, you start to realize that a two-word headline claim like a climate neutral, for example, doesn't really sum that up. And any clever critic would be able to look at any part of the strategy and say, well, you're still doing this thing, so you can't be climate neutral. And so that's really where that problem in the discourse is coming from. And so we look to a shift in mindset, as away from companies as individual self-centered actors trying to win a game, towards being a contributor in a bigger game, if you like. And alongside this, we have in those various areas some publications and some initiatives that are worth looking out for. In the value chain side, we have the AIM platform working with SBTI and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and we have the Value Change Initiative founded by Gold Standard and SustainCert that looks explicitly in the region of goods and services, especially in agriculture, apparel, and other sectors. And I'll leave it to Robert to speak more about the other program we announced today on Beyond Value Chain Mitigation, which we're super excited about. But go on a slide there, Jamie. The last thing I wanted to say on these key observations and the whole framework, I suppose, is Gold Standard's flagship standard, Gold Standard for the Global Goals, is there to certify mitigation and sustainable development action. And it's the outputs of that certification and those actions that can be used as inputs to various places in these frameworks. So as we were developing it, we were very much thinking, how does our carbon market portfolio react to this? Well, we'll make sure they're aligned so that the companies using it can use those credits for this purpose. How do our fund requirements, which we're piloting at the moment, how do they play in? Well, you could imagine a value chain fund or a BVCM fund. And so alignment with SBTI and this framework will be critical in leveraging that value. And if we go on a slide, I'll just sum up what's next for these frameworks and documents. So I would say, as Jamie said, they're presented right now as for discussion, and we're very much welcoming feedback, ideas, collaboration, support, co-working of all kinds, really, throughout 2023. We're really interested in what you think. Is this a useful exercise? What did we miss? Also, during 2023 and into 2024, we want to add the adaptation and resilience elements. So the first element here is mitigation focused, but we recognize the need to think about how companies can build in adaptation and resilience frameworks, and how to think about the equivalent in nature and societal playbooks aligning with things like SBTN. So really speaking to the mission of the foundation as climate security and sustainable development for all. In 2024, the intent is to release a fully updated and adopted version, so no longer for discussion, but Gold Standard's formal thinking and position. Then thinking year on year, if the concept is welcomed by the community, that we would release it with updates so that every year the delta becomes a kind of state and trends, and also a touch point for companies to be able to see the kind of whole elephant in one go. And so that's really where we go next. And I'll stop there, Jamie, for the panel.
Great, thank you very much indeed for that, Owen. We'll now get on to asking questions of the panel, but before I do, just a reminder for those who've joined that there will be a section for kind of questions from the audience at the end. So if you do have any questions, pop them into the Q&A, and we can put them to the panel at that point. So my first question is to Steve. Value chains represent 70% plus of global emissions, with agriculture being a major component. And that also impacts on food security, nature, welfare, etc., etc., etc. What can we do, and how can we do a better job of collective action around that?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on the panel today. It's great to be here. I think the first step is recognizing that our individual corporate climate goals are in service of a bigger collective goals. Especially if you're looking at an agricultural landscape, no individual company can impact that landscape on their own, and we would be much more impactful working together. Ideally in collaboration with local stakeholders. And, for a company to prioritize progress on their commitment above all else can pose barriers for collaboration and achieving progress on those collective goals. It can add a lot of cost and complexity and burden on implementing partners to have to quantify and allocate the carbon impact of an investment to each individual company. And, in the context that I operate in the North American row crops predominantly, I've seen how that need to communicate individual progress can shut down or reduce the impact of a collaboration. So, again, thinking kind of in that context of scope 3 agricultural emissions, I think, that mindset shift of being contributive towards shared goals can help avoid a siloed and, extractive approach of companies towards local communities. And, I ultimately, I believe that, will enable more collaboration and a bigger impact. And so, I think there's a gap in our current corporate accountability frameworks where companies, due to the nature of having a commitment that only applies to your company's footprint, we're incentivized to focus primarily on individual action because, that contribution and progress on shared goals is not as easily recognized, not as easy to talk about or claim. So, while that might be really effective for scope 1 or 2 emissions, that individual action, scope 3 emissions in agriculture are different, and require collaboration with other companies, the public sector, and agricultural, communities themselves. So, I think we need to figure out how to make claims about collective impact. I think we need to figure out how to determine what constitutes our fair share of an investment towards collective goals in a landscape. I know those things aren't easy, but as we gain experience in these areas as an industry, and if external stakeholders start to prioritize collective action, I think we'll get better at it.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Steve. Lene, next question to you. WWF's work to establish SBTI, the Science-Based Target Initiative, and also the corporate blueprint and subsequent papers in recent years points the way to defining kind of corporate responsibility for climate and nature. Can you give us an overview of what WWF think about that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. So yeah, we did publish the blueprint for corporate action on climate and nature in December 2020. And it confirms the mitigation hierarchy with the 1.5 degree aligned decarbonization targets, which means SBTI as a central pillar of any corporate climate strategy. So yeah, it's about SBTI and decarbonizing the own business as really key for the within value chain part. And this also, according to SBTI, means no reductions count that are bought elsewhere. I think that's an important thing. And then in the beyond value chain space, we clearly promote the contribution model and contribution claims. So for the claims, this means shifting away from misleading neutrality and compensation claims, which have been criticized a lot lately as well. Moving toward contributing claims, contributing finance, contribution to global goals, and so on. And also this means regarding the mechanism to shift away from the ton for ton offsetting towards a CO2 pricing instead. So ideally with the social costs of carbon considered, but also, of course, you can discuss phase-in options, discuss different realities for different sectors and so on. And the important point about this is that a budget for climate action is determined independent of the investment choice in the end. So you decouple that, and this makes it a really truly result-based investment and turns the race to the bottom into a race to the top. And this also then requires a mind shift in a way, how you think about the important question within your business. So it goes away from the questions like, are we carbon neutral? How can we best or cheapest offset our emissions, to other key questions like, for example, are my efforts aligned with global goals, with achieving global goals? Are we financing an appropriate mix towards contributing to these goals, and how can we contribute in the best way and with the highest value to these global goals? So the whole narrative you presented before, Owen, with the contributing to global goals fits quite nicely into our thinking.
Great, thank you, Lene. And now, Robert, your work in Beyond Value Chain Mitigation Funds is pioneering. Can you explain a bit about your approach and how do you see the role of BVCM funds as complementing and giving another option to the voluntary carbon market? And what do we need to do to make sure they have the quality and integrity?
Great, thank you very much. And thanks to previous speakers. I agree with everything I heard, and it's music to my ears when you describe it that way as well, Lena. And that's what we try to set out here with Milky Wires, an impact platform geared to get more funds to organizations working to solve environmental problems. And we set up this charitable fund called the Climate Transformation Fund in 2021, sort of a little bit on the back of the work that SBTI did on the net zero standard, calling for a BVCM, where met people like Owen was part of the group as well, and sort of that kind of thinking. And Milky Wire set up a fund that is designed to help maximize corporate contributions to reach global net zero. So it supports durable carbon removal solutions, new methods to take away CO2 from the atmosphere that mostly are like very nascent in the lab. We want to get them started, want to get them tested, but it's very expensive. So the whole idea that you have to offset all your emissions is something that's needed to move away from to be able to support those kind of new solutions there. That's quite costly. Also support nature restoration and protection. Could be carbon market projects, could also be NGOs that are, for example, very effective in working to protect forests or also restore them. And then also supporting organizations that are working in decarbonization, both like direct implementation, but also advocacy and policy, which by many organizations have been shown to be sometimes orders of magnitude more cost effective in actually reducing emissions, because they can go in and get decision makers to put more money into renewable energy or change laws and regulation or raise ambitions that result in quite a lot of emission reductions. So we really think that the idea should be to try to maximize your climate impact for your sort of climate dollars. And a way of doing that is, as Lena described, also to implement an internal carbon price. That's what we encourage the donors to the fund to do as well. And Klarna, the big fintech, they're the ones that helped us set up this fund from the beginning. They've been a donor from day one, and they implemented an internal carbon tax, $100 in scope 1, 2, and travel emissions, and $10 for rest of scope 3, and generating a climate budget. It's over several $1 million. I think it's $5 million in total for 3 years that they've been contributing. And then to this fund, to the project selected for the fund, and trying to maximize the climate impact. And now we have other donors such as Spotify and ING and Avanza and different actors in various sectors. And then on the second part of the question, how do you make sure this is effective? How do you ensure the quality? And there, as Owen alluded to, we're piloting something new here together with Gold Standard and also a soon-to-be launched organization called Murmur. And we're set out to design guidelines, public guidelines for how to operationalize beyond value chain mitigation. So building upon what the science-based target is doing, creating this kind of practical methods. How should you determine your contribution? What are the types of projects that should be supported, and how should you best sort of measure the impact and long-term results of those? Like, we do it to some extent in our own fund, but it needs to be further developed, and it needs to be also getting input from external actors and to be made into this kind of public goods that others could use. So this whole concept of beyond value chain mitigation and companies and individuals contributing to the wider targets becomes more mainstream.
Great, thank you, Robert. So now back to Steve. General Mills as a company is committed to sustainable landscape approaches, covering a range of its responsibilities as a business. How do you kind of get company buy-in to prioritize that sort of approach?
Yeah, I think it's really helped us to have a regenerative agriculture commitment, actually, which is more holistic across multiple outcomes, and it's not as rigid as a climate goal. And so, our senior leadership is very aligned with the need to, achieve multiple outcomes in these agricultural communities, from, soil health and biodiversity and water, farmer economic resilience, as well as, having regenerative agriculture, which we define as a holistic principles-based approach to farming and ranching that seeks to strengthen ecosystems and communities. That we see that as a lever for helping to reduce our scope 3 emissions goals, but it's much broader than that and more holistic. And so, at least up until now, it's really enabled us to invest in impactful, community-driven work without having to impose as much of a burden on farmers and local partners for claims. So I think that's just given us a lot of flexibility to invest in, really partner with communities that we, source in, to be as impactful as we can without necessarily needing to have kind of carbon attribution or claims come along with that, which can pose that kind of barrier to that type of local collaboration, like I mentioned before. So yeah, I mean, it's I think that just sort of highlights a little bit about this gap that we have in corporate accountability frameworks as you relate to what can we hold companies accountable to? What does progress look like from these corporate public types of claims versus what are these actions that are really needed in agricultural landscapes where we need to drive more investment, that having that gap between the climate goals and that local impact that's needed. I think that's just something that that we've recognized and that we're looking to have conversations about. And so it's exciting to see conversations like this, which I think are a big step in the right direction. But in the meantime, having a more flexible goal like a regenerative agriculture commitment, having the ability to talk about these things in more holistic ways, I think has been very useful for us.
Great, thanks, Steve. And Lene, corporate claims are increasingly under scrutiny at the moment and often led by mechanisms like the voluntary carbon market rather than considered kind of holistically. What is your view on the importance of claims being credible, and what should companies be thinking about when kind of deciding what claims they should be trying to make? Thanks
for that question. I agree, claims is really a topic that has been a lot debated about lately. Credible claims are really important for companies. And yeah, I think with the communication around sustainability about climate has increased so much over the years, and so has scrutiny, and that's a good thing. And there has been a lot of criticism lately, as you mentioned, and I think it's important to note that it has been on the claims, but the criticism also has been on the methods and on the incentives and on other aspects. So it's not only the claims, but of course claims are one important aspect about it. And many NGOs have been critical towards the neutrality and compensation claims for a while, including the whole offsetting mechanism, not only the claims. And so the shift to the contribution model regarding the claims, but also the mechanism behind it is completely justified and very important to have that discussion. And to the question, what do we advise companies around their claims and communication? Maybe, yeah, some general things we recommend them. So focus on your reduction measures as well, and put the focus, not only the focus of your targets, but also put it as a focus in your communication. Talk about what you actually do to decarbonize your company instead of talking about climate neutrality. Focus on material fields of action, not minor fields of action. Be clear about what you mean when you use terms like net zero and so on, and use them according to science and credible sources. For example, the SBTi, how they define net zero and not how maybe someone else defines it. And also important, don't only speak about long-term far away targets and things, also speak about near-term targets and near-term action. So really talk about what you do and talk less about what you plan to be doing in 2050. So yes, I think adapting claims will be key, but also adapting the mechanism, as mentioned before, to fund climate action will be key. And then also, yeah, linking that to MRV and the discussions about MRV is really important. I'm quite excited to learn about the new guidance, Robert, you mentioned, and I'm very excited to see that. I think this is something we really need.
Great, thank you, Lene. Talking about what you do is always good advice in comms, I think. So, Robert, you've also given a lot of thought to some really interesting climate actions, including being a pioneer in carbon dioxide removal and in indirect mitigation, such as enabling actions. What are the kind of key things you've learned, and how will you take those lessons into the BVCM approach?
That we really need to look at the problem of how we reach global net zero taking a wide perspective and not being narrowly focused on just one type of activities. Different companies can finance different things. Everyone doesn't have to finance everything. But if you look at it, there's definitely a broad set of activities that needs to be funded, and it includes some that where you know very certain what's going to happen, such as, for example, doing reforestation on degraded land. You can quite easily measure how many trees that it's going to be standing and how many tons that's going to avoid. Or if you do a concrete projects on decarbonization, it might be easy to measure, and such projects can be worthwhile funding in many cases. But then there are also projects that are much harder to know the exact effect of, but that can be very cost effective, as I already talked a little bit about advocacy and policy. There's a great organization called Founders Pledge that are advising sort of both companies, but mostly founders and philanthropists on how to best spend their climate dollars. And they've been pointing to the need to also accept uncertainty, and it can be very costly if you just try to stay away from it completely. And it's better to fund something, get a lot of, it's better to certainly have probably having a large impact than certainly having a little impact, so to say. And when you're helping to reach global net zero, you should also include projects where, such as the advocacy and policy, and not shy away from it just because you don't know exactly how it works. And also take the long-term perspective and not just focus exactly what happens now. So being able to support new technologies, for example, carbon removal is such an example. We can see that the new carbon removal methods are getting a lot of hype and attention, but the actual number of companies that are going in to fund them is quite limited. In 2022, there was only 16 companies that bought more than 1,000 tons of durable carbon removal solutions. So it's still a very nascent sector, and the hype is definitely much bigger than the actual amount of money going into it, because there you also need to accept some uncertainty and some sort of having a perspective where you're funding new solutions to see if they work and sort of get them to get down on the cost curve, which can be a very catalytic type of funding that has a huge effect in the long run. But then it needs to be within a framework that also looks at those type of effects and not just at the near term. So with the fund, we try to do both. We fund these kind of activities that are reforestation, for example, or decarbonization, that are very tangible, but also these kind of long-term impacts. So and also there's no right and wrong for one particular fund, that you would have different tastes and sort of pick and choose. But I think, when you look at the whole beyond value chain mitigation field, you would need to have that kind of broad perspective.
Right, no magic bullet. So make sure that you've got a broad perspective. Steve, how do you see the line between value chain abatement and beyond value chain mitigation? Is it a clear and bright line, or is there a bit more murky around the edges? What kinds of BVCM is General Mills most interested in?
Yeah, we're doing everything within our control to address value chain emissions. So, working with suppliers, we're part of the SLOCT, the Leadership on Climate Transition, so engaging suppliers in setting science-based targets and trying to really exert our influence and improve supply chain traceability and all those sorts of things. But there's still, like I mentioned before, like to work collaboratively in agricultural landscapes, it requires investments in those places that are very hard to directly attribute to reductions in value chain emissions. And so I think we're sort of in this gray area where we are making within value chain investments. So it's not necessarily BVCM, but they're not things that we can directly attribute to our value chain abatement. So I think we sort of fall in a gap between the two, just due to the nature of the complexity of these agricultural supply chains, and the types of investments that we need to make. It's not always directly paying a farmer to reduce emissions. It's sometimes hiring, increasing human capacity in local communities to be able to work with farmers in different ways. And so, that's more like indirect mitigation mechanisms, I guess. It's sort of the enabling conditions that need to exist for that decarbonization to occur. And so, I think it's So I'm excited to learn more about, BVCM, read the new guidance that's out, because I think we are looking for a creative, new solutions to really figure out what's the right way to appropriately contextualize the work that we are doing. How should we be talking about it? Is it BVCM or is it something else? Because it really is within value chain emissions that we're trying to address. So I don't know that I have a great answer, but it's definitely maybe a gray line there and a gap that we're in the middle of.
Great, thanks, Steve. So, Lene, SBTI recently published a consultation for its targets for nature. How do we kind of absorb this, take account of this as practitioners? How do we avoid silo targets and actions?
That's a big question. Thanks for this. Yeah, I think corporates are really challenged. Because it's not only climate, it's biodiversity, it's water, and so on. And yeah, how to do that best? You mentioned SBTN. Yeah, they developed methods to formulate science-based targets for water, for land, for ocean biodiversity, and the SBTI is doing the same for climate. So in a way, the formulation of targets will happen separately or in a silo, so to say. But I think this doesn't mean that the way we think about this and the way we are trying to reach these targets will happen or should happen in silos. So there are many measures that will have benefits for climate and nature, for biodiversity and livelihoods and so on. So and maybe linking it back to the discussion we started before about beyond value chain action, I call it now, not mitigation, because in a way it is beyond mitigation as well. It will have impact for adaptation and so on. So this means we should also think about investing in larger projects at the landscape scale, in nature-based solutions. We need to establish metrics beyond CO2 as a standard if we want to address also different topics. And how to do that best, I think it's a bit in a way it's a key question. It's not easy to answer. It's for the general things like exchange, discuss together, have all targets and topics in mind when defining strategies. Put together experts from different domains, but also having the right structures in place within a company, have according management decisions and management buy-in to discuss these things together, and the budget allocation for all these things as well. So it's also a big question on how you strategically handle these topics within your company, and certain things that need to happen. Maybe some very practical thing also, use the available free tools there are. For example, WWF has a water risk filter, has a biodiversity risk filter that is aligned with SBTN and the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure and so on. So there are tools that inform your decisions and can help you steer along.
Great, thank you, Lene. And then Robert, you're part of the SBTI expert advisory group on beyond value chain mitigation, or beyond value chain action, possibly, Lene. What do you think still needs to be answered to really unlock its potential?
Incentives. Like, we really need to create a narrative where companies are expected to do this. All companies should be expected to contribute to climate also outside their value chains. And that should be the default expectation from everyone. It will differ between different companies. So did some work together with Carbon Gap last year. We published a report called Bridging the Ambition Gap, looking at sort of who can afford to pay. And we can see it's huge differences between different types of sectors. And tech sector or insurance or banking have like profits of tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars per ton they emit. So if they implement an internal carbon fee, that can be high. Like they can have $200 per ton in all scopes. That's fine. They can afford it, and they can use that money to support projects outside their value chain. And they also have less needs for internal investments because they don't have like huge industrious facilities that needs to be rebuilt, or like a large fleet of trucks that needs to be replaced or something. So they very well equipped to spend a lot of money on beyond value chain action. But then even the ones that are lower profits per ton or have a lot of internal needs within value chain needs for money, they can also spend some on beyond value chain mitigation, and they should be doing it. And I think that really needs to be sort of what everyone is expecting, and beyond value chain mitigation needs to become so much bigger than the VCM, than the voluntary carbon market. It's only $2 billion in 2021, and even though it grew a lot, that's basically nothing. And the beyond value chain mitigation needs to be counted in the hundreds of billions of dollars, I think, and we can definitely get there if it becomes the default expectation that this is what companies should do. They should also contribute to help reach global net zero. It's one thing to help reach your own targets, but this is also something that's needed. And I hope that the SBTi, as the most credible actor, can set out guidelines and create ways to incentivize companies to do this, and also create this narrative and this whole discourse to help set that agenda. And it's something that we do together as well, right? As WWF and on the company side and from Gold Standard, etc.
Thanks, Robert. And I think the concept of profit per ton is a really interesting one to kind of think about when you're thinking about this sort of stuff. Owen, I'd like to come to you now for just one question before we open up to questions from the floor. What one tool do you wish existed that would further unlock your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the panelists have done an excellent job of framing most of the tools that need to exist. And I would say, I mean, I opened with the kind of reference to the parable of the three blind men and an elephant. And in a way, you know, Steve's work at General Mills is, you know, very clearly an organization that's seen the elephant. It's a bit of a strange phrase, but seeing that whole shift you towards regenerative agriculture rather than a, you know, an internally focused net zero target that just, you know, if you achieve it but nobody else does that really help? So you can already see the kinds of organizations that look at this differently. So I think there's probably a less so tools in the one sense, and more maybe shifts in mindset, I think, are some of the stuff that comes out of this. But there are some specific tools. I think once you can see the whole elephant, then you start to be able to look at the moving parts and think about, you know, how do you build some of the incentive structures, as Robert said, in BVCM? How do you give companies you know, the opportunity to say, look, you know, this is very complicated. If I try and, you know, account for my emissions towards net zero in this very complicated landscape, if there was a genuine, credible transitionary landscape program, could I not just put an accounting note that says I'm fairly contributing to that instead? So I don't have a specific tool in mind. I think more like I would say, you know, look at this whole piece and think about, you know, well, actually, if you can see the whole and you can start to see the culture shift from, oh, I'm entirely internally focused to one where I'm, you know, part of a much bigger game than just myself and my organization, then it starts to allow us to unlock some of the problems that Robert and Steve pointed out. I think, you know, I would say, you know, there is a need, I think, for well, not a need, there's an essential need for regulation. So I would point out that, you know, we won't voluntary our way to net zero and beyond. That's impossible. Regulation is going to have to be a huge part of this. But I would also say regulation doesn't always see the elephant, right? It does often pick at little parts of it. It doesn't necessarily choose the most ambitious pathway. And so while I would like to see regulation supersede voluntary, I do think it's worth noting that if voluntary is genuinely ambitious and, you know, holistic, then voluntary can also lead regulation, which becomes super important. So I think I dodged your question on about 5 different fronts there, Jamie. So
I expected no less. Thanks, Owen. Whilst I've got you, I think the first question from the floor is one for you. So how does Gold Standard's guidance align with the VCMI claims code of conduct, second version of which is likely to be released soon?
Yeah, so we engaged a lot with VCMI. So with yeah, big thanks to Lydia and Brad Shallett, who's there on a secondment from Winrock International, and you know, those are two people that have been, you know, heavily embedded in this whole conversation of you know, shifting claims and shifting narratives for a good long while. I think the VCMI guidance comes out at the end of June. We tried our best to align with what we think it might say, but we haven't seen it, so it's difficult for us to say we're perfectly aligned. I would recommend people look out for it and consider it and read it. It's been written by smart people. I think it'll complement our work and will complement VCMI really nicely. And I'd say generally then, this whole framework and the considerations on claims and our work at the AIM platform on value chain and the work with Robert on BVCM, they're all things that are very much conversations with other leaders in industry and in civil society. So one way to read this whole package of documents we've released today is very much standing on the shoulders of giants, with hopefully a twist of GS in there as well.
Great. Thanks, Owen. Next question is around kind of communications, and I think Lena has sort of answered this in her general answer, but I'd be interested in the perspectives from others of the panel. So it's around kind of contribution claims versus compensation claims. So contribution's a bit harder for brands to use in comms. How can we help make it a compelling approach for brands compared to the simplicity of a compensation claim? And Steve, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe what some of this is getting at is like an inherent tension between the fact that we talk about a lot of this work in sustainability as being pre-competitive, and yet when you're trying to do something like brand communications, that's a very competitive space. So I think maybe just some of the challenge here is reconciling those two things. I'm a soil scientist. I'm not in marketing, but I do know that different brands have different needs already for communicating with their unique consumers. And so the brands already have this challenge of figuring out how do we talk about this work, not just in one kind of uniform standard way, but in a way that's actually going to resonate with their consumers. And oftentimes that's, through human stories, through that work that we are doing. So that's from a very, consumer-centric kind of lens. But I think also I think it's just going to take time in influencing investors and external stakeholders to start asking the questions about, contribution towards shared collective landscape approaches, for example, rather than individual corporate goals. I think it just takes that kind of education and awareness of those external stakeholders to start to ask these different questions, and then that sort of drives the incentivization to communicate progress differently. So I think we're doing that through spaces like this, but it's just going to take some more time to help resource other folks to think about what questions do you ask, and what are the metrics that you should be looking for companies to communicate. And it probably looks a bit different than it does today if we're trying to achieve some of this paradigm and mindset shift.
Thanks, Steve. Owen, I know you and I have talked about this a bit, but Robert's put his hand up, so I'm going to go to him first.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear what Owen had to say as well, but of course it's not as simple. You can't put the stamp on it, so it takes a little bit more effort. But we've seen great results from companies that are communicating this. I think Klarna, as we've been working with, have been very successful in being able to communicate all the great products that they're then supporting through the fund, and also the impact the resulting from that. But I think one point I want to make is that it's not enough if we convince all the companies that were making compensation claims to do this, because that's also too small. Like this needs to be much bigger. So that's like partial win. Like, yeah, if the companies that are making compensation claims shift to make contributions, it's good, but we really need to take it to a few levels up as well, and find ways where this is the expected, and where companies are doing this because they're genuinely committed to help reach global net zero.
Yeah, I only add a couple of things really. I think legitimacy is one thing, and I think credible actors saying this is the credible way forward really helps. We're not somehow de facto wedded to older models, but it can feel like that sometimes, and that's illogical. I think one thing that occurs to me is that we're also wedded to the climate mitigation hierarchy, this kind of classical reduce your own emissions and then offset what's left over, which is very kind of, it's not even last generation, it's like the generation before last at this point. And actually that isn't a very credible way to act, right? The credible way to act has to be that you abate your own emissions and you take responsibility for what's ongoing, like not doing both. Like if you just do your abatement of your own emissions, which according to the mitigation hierarchy is your priority, that's still not good enough. You're still not a credible, positive, fair contributor to these efforts, right? You're still doing harm. You're still sort of lighting matches while the world burns. So that's quite a harsh message. People don't love to hear that, but that's the truth of it. And I think what you end up with then is, you think of offsetting approaches as the only way to do this. offsetting strikes me as the kind of thing you do when you can only see that little part of the elephant, right? When you can see the whole elephant, you start to think, well, actually, ton for ton, that's good. It might be what I want to do, might helps me, but I can also make mistakes now because I'm seeing this whole picture. And if we can kind of, embed this paradigm shift in the way companies correct themselves as they go, and you can see this whole picture, then it starts to make more sense. I would also say, just as a final mark, I think kind of the current generation, kids being advertised to, there's no fooling them, right? Like, nobody in that generation believes anybody can be nature positive or climate neutral in the state of the world as it is now. So I think just there is also a push away from some of those older claims that just don't really make a lot of sense anymore. And given you can't be credible without doing this action, something needs to come in and replace it, which isn't the most charismatic way of explaining it, but I think, is important to note as well.
Great. Thanks, Owen. Okay, next question, I think probably to Robert. Are we likely to see sectoral standards for BVCM based on your kind of ability to pay concept, and where it makes best sense for different sectors to spend based on their expertise?
Yes, I think especially in terms of sort of expected contributions, I think you could see those kind of differentiation. And we published our internal, a white paper on setting internal carbon fees, and try to take a stab at this using the analysis of profit per ton and making recommendations for different types of sectors depending on their carbon intensity and their profit per ton. But that's an area. It was really version 1, so it's an area where we're taking in feedback, and I think you can view it in different ways, but ultimately the ability to pay really differs. So there will need to be some differentiation there, and there might also be other things, like some sectors might want to invest in activities that are close to them. Even though they're not within their value chain, they might want to do something that's in the agriculture sector or in sort of manufacturing or textiles, etc. So that could also be something, even if it's not mandatory. It's something that many could be interested in.
Yeah, and I think that's something we see in the voluntary carbon market as well, right? People, because credits contribute to different of the global goals. So, people, if you're an organization that works in health, you might well choose to invest in credits that are related to health. Owen, have you got anything to add on that, or anyone else want to chip in?
I need to agree with Rob. I highly recommend that Milky Wire white paper, which I think speaks to different ways to approach setting the carbon price, in combinations of emissions intensity and profitability, which you could imagine cascading into sectoral guidance. The only other thing I would say is this is just purely my thoughts on the subject, is I could imagine in beyond value chain mitigation, you have this pot of money that should be financing ambitious activity. I think one of the interesting things about beyond value chain mitigation as a pot of money is it can target things that aren't easy to target in any other way. So it can target things that aren't in anybody's value chain. Think like the landscape restoration stuff around Steve's landscapes that you mentioned earlier, or think clean cooking, something we're really well known for. Not obviously in somebody's value chain, therefore not part of somebody's target, but also things that are hard to regulate. So governments, can regulate against making things worse. They don't often regulate for restoration, for example, and nobody likes to be regulated for the way they cook. So beyond value chain mitigation as a pot of money is actually really usefully put to those things that other things can't reach so easily. So my sense has always been there's some sort of golden ratio, probably sector by sector, that says everybody should support restoration of nature and communities' access to services at some level. And then the mix of what is left over is probably a combination of things like what's scientifically advantageous, maybe methane right now, and maybe what's your sector, what should your sector be thinking about most as a priority. But that's the kind of work that we want to do in that BVCM program, working with the likes of SBTI.
Great, thank you. And Lene, you've got something to add on this one?
Yes, exactly. I think, regarding this sector guidance, or how to define what to contribute, I think it should be clear, and there should be a best practice which holds for all sectors and all companies, which is the social cost of carbon as North Star. If you can pay that, if you're willing to pay that, you should pay that, no? Because that's what we should aim at. And then clearly there is the aspect of ability to pay that comes in attached to some economic indicators and so on. And we also internally discussed a lot on how to build this up best. And we also discussed the profit aspect, I think, which is really interesting. And I think there's so much more to do and look at. We discussed it. It's a bit difficult because it varies every year. So your price varies every year depending on your profit that year. Then also it is linked to management skills in a way. I mean, some do better than others and perform better than others. So it's not probably not enough to only look at that. But we also concluded that after this best practice, which is clear, there needs to be a step which accounts for the ability to pay. And this should also not be confused with a willingness to pay, which is then again another step. So yeah, but I think there is still some work to be done. And it's great that different organizations and people start working on that now.
Great, thank you. I think we've probably got quite time for one more question. So there's an interesting one here about the kind of landscape level projects. So one for you, I think, initially, Steve. So under a contribution approach, how do we know our actions are leading to carbon removal or reductions? Can you speak to kind of financial contribution model and the monitoring at a landscape level?
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, this is something that we've spent a lot of focus on is this landscape monitoring approach. Because in addition to kind of monitoring where we have direct investments, working with farmers, doing things like soil sampling and greenhouse gas modeling for individual fields, we also want to be able to understand, well, what are the average emissions for wheat in this entire landscape? Because that's ultimately, in a commodity kind of supply chain, our wheat is being blended and moves around, in these different landscapes. So we really do need to understand the whole of this place, like the Northern Plains in the US and Canada, for example, is an example of one of those landscapes. And so we work with a company called Regrow to do satellite imagery and greenhouse gas modeling. And then we can work with, with local kind of, universities and research partners to improve the calibration and validation of those models, to do targeted sampling, but with the goal of really understanding the emissions at that landscape scale, not necessarily just the emissions associated with our direct investment. And I think the more we can coalesce around these, shared tools for landscape level modeling, I think and monitoring, the more effective we'll be, because right now, with all these individual company supply chains and goals, there's so much waste and duplicative efforts in the monitoring and tracking of emissions. And, especially with multiple billion-dollar investment from the US government for climate smart commodities, I mean, I think there's just a huge amount of duplicative work going on to come up with different pathways for quantifying and allocating emissions to individual actors. And we just don't have the kind of resources for that amount of waste and duplicative effort. So the more we can kind of align on measuring things collectively at those landscape scales, I think the more effective we'll be with our limited pool of resources and can focus more of the effort on actually driving impact and take a lower burden approach to the quantification of outcomes.
Great, thank you. Has anyone got anything they want to add on that in kind of 30 seconds, given we're running up towards the end of our time?
I mean, I think there's a thread run through everything, isn't there, on MRV? So monitoring, reporting, verification, and there's a tendency to think, within the greenhouse gas protocol and scope 3 that, there's enough already that we know how to do that, but there's a whole world in that needs to be improved. And I think there's an assumption in the beyond value chain mitigation side that, if we step away from offsetting, then MRV somehow becomes, cowboy country. You can do whatever you like, but that isn't true either. The norms in carbon markets were defined. Norms in the brave new world of BVCM, as Robert said, will be defined. And then the sweet spot will be things like landscapes that can cover both of those things and attribute the benefits to different forms of targets accordingly to the data quality available.
Great. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the session. All that remains is for me to thank Owen, Lene, Steve, and Robert for their time. I found it very helpful. I hope you all did too. As I said, this has been recorded, so we'll circulate it to everyone. And this is the start of the conversation. I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions, but feel free to kind of reach out and please do kind of engage with us as we continue thinking about this stuff in the future. So thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.